I never imagined that coming back from my long-awaited solo trip, refreshed and ready to start my new chapter in life, would throw me right into the middle of a neighborhood war with a woman who thought she controlled everything and everyone around her. But that's exactly what happened, and it started the very night I moved in. So before I tell you how I turned the tables on her and legally blocked her only spot in a way that left the entire HOA stunned, make sure you stick around to the very end of this story and subscribe to Sham Stories, because trust me, you're not going to believe how this one unfolded. Now picture this. I had just returned from a 3-month backpacking trip through Europe, something I had dreamed of doing for years. I wanted to start fresh in a new home where I could finally settle down. So when I bought a small but charming townhouse in a community run by an HOA, I thought it would be perfect, quiet, clean, structured. I had no idea that one neighbor in particular was about to make my life absolute chaos. Her name was Karen, and she was the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. The kind of person who had the rules memorized better than anyone else, or at least the parts of the rules that suited her. She had no official power other than being on the HOA board, but the way she strutted around barking orders and filing complaints. You'd think she owned the entire block. I hadn't even been inside my new home for more than an hour when the drama started. I had just dragged my last suitcase inside, sweaty and exhausted from traveling all day, when I heard the sound of heels clicking on the pavement outside. I peeked through the blinds and saw a woman with sharp features, bleached blonde hair in a tight bun, and a clipboard in her hand marching right up to my door like she was about to serve me court papers. I barely had time to breathe before the knocking started, sharp and aggressive. I opened the door and was greeted with a piercing stare. "You can't park there," she snapped. Without even saying hello, I blinked, confused. My car was sitting neatly in the driveway, well within the property lines. "Excuse me?" I asked, trying to keep my cool. She jabbed her finger toward my car. "This community has designated parking rules. That spot is reserved. You can't just dump your car wherever you please." I wanted to laugh because it was literally my own driveway. "That's my house. That's my driveway," I explained. "I'm pretty sure I can park there." She narrowed her eyes and scribbled something on her clipboard. "We'll see about that," she muttered and stormed off. I thought maybe she was just having a bad day. But oh no, this was just the beginning. Later that night, when I finally started unpacking, I heard sirens and flashing lights filled the street. I rushed to the window, and my jaw dropped. There were 2 police cruisers parked outside my house. Officers stepping out and shining flashlights at my car. I rushed outside in a panic. "What's going on?" I asked. One of the officers looked at me and asked, "Are you the owner of this vehicle?" I nodded yes. "It's my car. This is my driveway." They glanced at each other and explained that they got a call from someone, claiming a suspicious vehicle was parked illegally and possibly abandoned. My blood boiled. Karen was standing across the street with her arms crossed, smirking like she had won some sort of battle. I immediately pointed at her. "She called, didn't she?" I asked. The officer gave a small shrug and said they couldn't disclose that. But it was obvious. I had only been here a few hours, and this woman had already called the cops on me for parking in my own driveway. I showed the officers my paperwork, the deed to the house, and my driver's license. They confirmed everything checked out and apologized for the inconvenience before leaving. Karen didn't even look ashamed. In fact, she had the audacity to say loud enough for me to hear, "Some people just don't belong here." I ignored her that night, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The next morning, I woke up to find a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. Apparently, I was being fined by the HOA for improper parking. I couldn't believe it. I marched over to the HOA office with the notice in hand, demanding answers. The property manager, a timid man named Roger, looked embarrassed as he explained that a board member had reported me. When I asked which one, he hesitated, but finally admitted it was Karen. Apparently, she had twisted the rules to make it seem like my driveway was somehow off limits for overnight parking, which wasn't true at all. I pulled out the HOA handbook and highlighted the section that proved I was right. Roger sighed and agreed to remove the violation, but warned me that Karen was persistent. I left feeling frustrated, but determined not to be pushed around. For the next few days, I tried to settle in, but Karen was relentless. She knocked on my door multiple times with petty complaints. My trash cans were half an inch too close to the curb. My blinds didn't match the community aesthetic. I had left a garden hose out for more than an hour. Each time I tried to reason with her, she doubled down and threatened more fines. It was harassment, plain and simple. Then came the final straw. I returned home one afternoon to find Karen standing in my driveway again, this time arguing with a delivery driver who had brought me a new piece of furniture. She was screaming that the truck was blocking her space. But there was no such designated space near my property. She was making it up. I had had enough. Told her point blank, Karen, this is my property. This is my space. If you don't like it, call the cops again. She glared at me and hissed. Don't think you can just waltz in here after your little vacation and change the rules? This neighborhood. That's when it hit me. If she was so obsessed with parking and rules, maybe I could beat her at her own game. I started digging through the HOA handbook again, reading every little clause, every rule about parking, common areas, easements, and that's when I found it. A loophole, one that Karen had overlooked for years. A loophole that would allow me to legally block the one spot she relied on the most, the very spot she believed was untouchable. And I knew right then that if she wanted war, I was going to give it to her. The moment I walked out of that meeting with the board's decision in my favor, I felt a surge of satisfaction. But it lasted only a few hours because by the next morning, I knew Karen wasn't going to take her loss quietly. Stepped outside to get the mail and saw her car parked crookedly in the middle of the street, blocking half the lane as if to make some kind of statement. She stood there leaning against it with her arms crossed, glaring at me like a predator waiting for a slip. Enjoy your little victory, she called out mockingly, because it won't last. People like you don't belong here and I'll make sure of it. I ignored her and went inside, but that day set the tone for the weeks that followed. Karen escalated in every way she could think of. Violation notices began appearing on my door almost daily, some so ridiculous they bordered on comedy. One claimed my lawn grass was a quarter-inch too tall. Another accused me of having improper decorative choices because I had placed a welcome mat with a bright pattern by my door. I challenged each one, documented everything, forced the HOA office to rescind them. But the sheer persistence was draining. I caught her sneaking photos of my house late at night, crouched near the curb with her phone out. When I confronted her, she yelled that she was gathering evidence. Evidence of what she wouldn't say. Neighbors began whispering that Karen had gone off the rails, but still most stayed quiet. Nobody wanted to be her next target. One evening, as I was unloading groceries from my car, she suddenly walked over with her phone already in hand recording me. Look at this. He's dumping trash on the property, she said loudly, even though I was literally just carrying bags into my kitchen. I told her to stop filming me, but she smirked and said, "Public space. I can do what I want." That was the moment I realized she wasn't just trying to intimidate me. She was trying to create a record, twisting things into lies she could. Later I decided then that I had to start recording everything too. I installed security cameras around my property, clear visible ones that covered my driveway, front yard, and even caught the edge of the street. Within a week, those cameras paid off. Late one night, I caught Karen on video dragging her garbage into the middle of my driveway and leaving it there. When I woke up and found it the next morning, I checked the footage, and sure enough, there she was in her nightgown, smirking at the camera, as if daring me to call her out. I sent the footage straight to the HOA office and demanded action. Roger called me back apologetically. We'll issue her a warning. But you should know the board is reluctant to punish her too harshly because of her influence. I couldn't believe it. This woman was terrorizing me, and yet the board was afraid of her. That's when I realized I had to take matters into my own hands. I began researching local laws about harassment, stalking, and HOA abuse of power. I found that many of Karen's actions qualified as harassment under state law, especially the constant false reports and attempts to block access to my property. I consulted with a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes, a sharp and confident woman named Linda, who immediately understood what I was dealing with. "She's trying to break you down through intimidation," Linda told me. "But if you stay calm and document everything, we can build a case that not only shuts her down, but also forces the HOA to rein her in." I hired Linda on the spot. Meanwhile, Karen seemed to sense I was planning something because her attacks grew bolder. One Saturday morning, I found police cars outside my house. Again. Apparently, Karen had called them claiming I was hosting unauthorized construction because a contractor had come to fix a leaky pipe in my basement. The officers were annoyed when they realized it was a false alarm. One even muttered under his breath, "She does this a lot," which told me I wasn't the first victim. Later that day, another neighbor, an older woman named Marjorie, came to my door and quietly told me, "You're doing what we've all been too scared to do, stand up to her, don't give up." Hearing that gave me strength. I knew I wasn't alone, even if most people were still silent. As weeks passed, the battle lines hardened. Karen stopped pretending to be neighborly at all. Every time I stepped outside, she was there, glaring, muttering insults, sometimes even yelling across the street about how I was ruining the community. But instead of making me back down, it only made me more determined. Finally, my lawyer filed an official harassment complaint, not only against Karen, but also against the HOA for failing to control her behavior. When they received the paperwork, the panic was immediate. Roger called me begging to resolve things. Quietly, saying the board didn't want legal trouble. I told him flatly, "You should have thought of that before letting her run wild." Meanwhile, Karen was furious. She banged on my door one evening, demanding I drop the complaint. Shouting that I would regret it if I didn't answer, but my cameras caught every second of her meltdown. When I handed that footage to my lawyer, she smiled and said, "This is gold. The case was moving forward." And for the first time since moving in, I felt like the tide was finally starting to turn. But I also knew Karen wasn't the type to go down without one last vicious strike, and I braced myself for whatever storm she was about to unleash next. By the time Karen's second citation came through after her car was towed from blocking my driveway, the cracks in her control over the neighborhood were showing everywhere. People who once avoided me out of fear began cautiously waving when I walked by. A few even stopped to chat, telling me how grateful they were that someone finally had the courage to push back against her. I could feel the balance shifting, but at the same time, Karen's behavior was spiraling in darker directions. One evening, I found small nails scattered across the end of my driveway, enough to puncture a tire if I hadn't spotted them in time. My cameras didn't catch her that night, but I didn't need proof to know it was her. Another morning, I woke up to find a dead plant ripped out of my front garden and thrown on my porch. Childish, destructive, and bitter. It was like she wanted to leave constant reminders that she was still watching, still trying to rattle me. But each stunt only made her look more unstable to the rest of the neighborhood. The board members, who once hesitated to act, were now avoiding her completely. At the next HOA newsletter, her name was noticeably absent from the leadership list. Her reign was crumbling, and yet the more she lost, the more dangerous she became. One night as I was getting out of my car, she peered out of the shadows and hissed, "You think you've won, but you don't know what I'm capable of," before storming off into the dark. I reported it to the police, but without video proof, they could only log it as a complaint. My lawyer reassured me that the mounting pile of reports and citations was building a stronger case each day. I couldn't ignore the tension that knotted in my stomach every time I stepped outside. I had to stay vigilant. The next turning point came when the court date for her vandalism charge finally arrived. I showed up with my lawyer, my footage, and my documentation. Karen strutted into the courtroom as if she still believed she was untouchable, dressed sharply and sneering at me across the aisle. But her confidence evaporated when the judge played the footage of her spray painting my garage, clear as day. She stammered excuses about being set up and edited. But the evidence was undeniable. The judge fined her heavily and put her on probation for harassment-related behavior. It was a crushing blow to her ego. After the hearing, she stormed out of the courthouse screaming about conspiracies. Cameras flashing as neighbors who had come to watch shook their heads in disbelief. I walked out calmly, knowing the law was finally catching up to her. But that victory brought an even more chaotic backlash. Karen went on a rampage of intimidation, posting ranting videos online about how she was the victim, plastering flyers around the neighborhood with wild accusations about me, even trying to rally her remaining allies, to stage a petition against me. But it was too late. The community had seen the truth with their own eyes. The more she shouted, the more isolated she became. I even overheard one of her old allies telling another neighbor, "She's lost it completely. I don't want anything to do with her." The board officially banned her from attending meetings. For 6 months, a punishment she screamed about endlessly. Still, I knew she wasn't finished, and sure enough, one night after all seemed quiet. I woke to the sound of glass shattering. I rushed downstairs to find a rock had been hurled through my front window. The cameras caught nothing but a shadowy figure running off into the night. I called the police again, filed another report, and boarded up the window. But deep down, I knew Karen's desperation was reaching its peak. She had lost her position, her reputation, and her grip on the neighborhood, and all she had left was raw anger. My lawyer assured me that with everything piling up, we were close to filing a restraining order, something that would legally bar her from coming near my property. It gave me a small sense of comfort, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that before this war ended, Karen was going to make one final reckless move, something that would change the neighborhood forever and finally prove beyond all doubt just how far she was willing to go to cling to the control she no longer had. The storm came sooner than I expected, and it was uglier than I could have imagined. Just 3 days after my lawyer filed the harassment complaint, I woke up to find that someone had spray-painted the words "Get out" across my garage door. In thick red paint, my stomach dropped the moment I saw it. But my first reaction wasn't fear, it was anger. I knew exactly who was behind it. My cameras caught Karen creeping onto my property in the dead of night with a can of spray paint in her hand. She didn't even bother to hide her face. She looked straight at the camera as if daring me to use the footage. I immediately called the police, and this time when they arrived, I didn't have to argue or explain anything. I showed them the video, and one officer sighed heavily, saying, "Looks like we've got enough here to press charges." They went across the street to Karen's house and knocked on the door. I stood on my porch watching as she answered in her robe, pretending to be confused, but when the officers told her she was being cited for vandalism and harassment, her face twisted into pure rage. She shouted at me from across the street, "You'll regret this. You'll regret ever moving here." As they wrote up the report, the whole neighborhood peeked out from behind their curtains, some even stepping outside to watch. And for the first time, I saw Karen stripped of her false authority, looking less like the queen she thought she was, and more like a desperate bully caught red-handed. The police didn't arrest her on the spot, but they handed her a citation and told her she would have to appear in court. That was a small victory, but Karen wasn't finished. Over the next week, she launched a campaign of retaliation that made the air in the neighborhood toxic. She sent out mass emails to the HOA, accusing me of being violent and unstable, claiming I was harassing her and creating division. She even doctored photos to make it look like I had left trash all over my yard. Thankfully, my cameras disproved every lie, but the smear campaign still left me drained. Some neighbors avoided me entirely, too afraid to take sides, while others quietly slipped notes into my mailbox thanking me for standing up to her. Then came the HOA emergency meeting. It's called specifically to address the conflict between Karen and me. I showed up with my lawyer, binder full of evidence, and video footage ready to play. Karen arrived with her usual entourage, storming into the room like she was on trial for her life. She ranted about how I was destroying the community, screaming that I was a menace. But when my lawyer calmly presented the footage of her vandalizing my property, yelling threats, and harassing me night after night, the room went dead silent. Roger, the property manager, looked pale. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, and for once, Karen had no comeback. She stammered something about fabricated evidence, but the timestamps, police reports, and officer testimonies spoke louder than her excuses. My lawyer then laid it out clearly: either the HOA took decisive action against Karen, or we would pursue a lawsuit for negligence and harassment. The weight of that threat finally broke the board's silence. The chairperson announced that Karen was being stripped of her position on the board, effective immediately, and fined 4 repeated violations. I'll never forget the look on her face. Sheer disbelief followed by a scream of fury as she shouted, "You can't do this to me. I am this community." Before storming out, Neighbors whispered as the meeting adjourned. Some even clapped softly. I walked out with my lawyer feeling a sense of triumph, but also a knot in my stomach because I knew Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. Sure enough, the very next day, she parked her car directly across my driveway, blocking me in, and refused to move it for hours. When I called the police again, she screamed at them too, calling them corrupt and accusing them of conspiring with me. They towed her car and gave her another citation. Each strike against her made her weaker legally, but more dangerous personally. One night I caught her pacing in front of my house, muttering to herself. Another night she banged on my door at 2 in the morning before running off when the cameras caught her. It was like watching someone unravel in real time. Still, every time she lashed out, I added it to my growing file, and my lawyer told me, "She's burying herself. Just keep collecting. Yes. You're going to come out of this stronger than ever." But in the back of my mind, I wondered how far Karen was willing to go before she finally broke completely. Because if losing her parking spot had driven her to this level of obsession, what would happen when she realized she had lost everything she thought she controlled? Karen's arrest was the moment the neighborhood finally breathed again. But for me, it wasn't over just yet, because the legal process had to play out, and I had to see if she would truly face consequences for everything she had done. In the weeks following her arrest, the community felt like it had been freed from a storm cloud. People who had once been silent were suddenly outside again, chatting, planting flowers, even waving at me openly, something that would have been unthinkable. Just a month earlier, I started to feel like maybe I had finally found the home I wanted after my solo trip, a place where I could breathe. But then came the court hearings, and each one reminded me that Karen wasn't going to slip quietly into the background. The first hearing was for violating the restraining order. The judge reviewed the footage of her trying to slash my tires, and her attorney scrambled to claim she had been checking on community safety. The courtroom laughed at that excuse. The judge was stern, sentencing her to community service, extended probation, and mandatory anger management. It was clear the system was finally holding her accountable. But the real blow came when the HOA board, emboldened by her arrest, voted to permanently revoke her membership privileges, meaning she couldn't vote, couldn't serve, and couldn't interfere with anyone ever again. She lost all her power, and you could see it in her eyes as she sat there, hollow and defeated. She tried one last time to glare at me, as if her stare alone could break me, but it was empty now. Her reign was finished. The weeks after that were quiet, almost eerily so. I no longer woke to banging on my door or found violation notices taped to my house. I no longer had to flinch when I heard sirens. Neighbors started telling me how grateful they were. Some even invited me over for coffee, and slowly the neighborhood began to feel like a real community again. One where people weren't living under the thumb of a bully. As for Karen, word spread that she was putting her house on the market. Some said she couldn't handle the humiliation of staying. Others whispered that the fines, legal fees, and loss of her HOA privileges had finally broken her financially. I didn't know if those rumors were true, but one evening, I saw the for sale sign go up in her yard, and I felt a weight lift from my chest. The war was finally ending. The spot she once guarded like a throne was empty now. It's the same spot I had legally blocked her from using, and the irony wasn't lost on me. She had built her identity on control, on power, on that parking space, and in the end, that very thing had been her downfall. When moving trucks finally pulled up to her house weeks later, neighbors gathered quietly on the sidewalks. Watching as she loaded up her belongings, she didn't look at anyone, didn't wave, didn't say goodbye. She just climbed into her car and drove away. For the first time since I had moved in, the street felt free. The kids played in the lane, neighbors smiled openly, and I stood there, knowing that no matter how hard she had tried, she hadn't broken me. In fact, she had only made me stronger. The neighborhood was mine now too, not because I ruled it, but because I had earned my place by standing up for myself and refusing to back down. And that's when it hit me. This story wasn't just about fighting off a bully. It was about reminding people that no matter how powerful someone pretends to be, they can always be stopped with persistence, patience, and the truth. And if you've stuck with me through this entire story, Let this be the reminder that standing up to a Karen, whether it's in an HOA at work or in life, is always worth it, because the only way they win is if we stay silent. So if you want to hear more stories like this, filled with drama, justice, and twists you won't believe, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now to Sham Stories, because trust me, the next one is even wilder, and you won't want to miss it. I couldn't stop thinking about that loophole I had discovered in the HOA handbook. The more I read it, the more I realized it wasn't just a small oversight. It was a massive blind spot that could turn the tables completely. The section covered easements and shared access points. And buried in the language was a rule about how any homeowner whose property bordered a shared path or access lane could legally petition to restrict access if they could prove safety concerns. Karen's only parking spot happened to be right along the narrowest shared access lane in the community. She always bragged about how she had priority there because her house sat closest to it. But technically it wasn't her property, it was a shared easement. And by the wording of the rules, I could file for a restriction that would effectively block her from ever using it again. I knew it wouldn't be easy and that she would fight tooth and nail, but the idea of beating her with her own beloved HOA rules gave me the motivation I needed. The next few days I quietly gathered information. I noticed how Karen used that spot constantly, how she parked there every single day even though her garage was empty and perfectly functional. It turned out she had filled her garage with junk, old furniture, boxers, even a treadmill she never used. So instead of cleaning it out, she just hogged the easement spot and bullied others away from it. Several neighbors whispered to me that they hated it, but nobody dared challenge her. One man named Steve told me, "If you take that spot from her, the whole neighborhood will throw you a party." That gave me even more fuel. So I went to the HOA office and filed a formal request. Citing the rule word for word, I explained that Karen's daily use of the spot created a safety hazard. Delivery trucks struggled to get through, children playing nearby were at risk, and visibility was blocked. I attached photos and even short videos I had taken showing how congested the lane became whenever Karen parked there. Roger, the property manager, raised his eyebrows when he saw my request. "You know this is going to stir up a hornet's nest, right?" he asked cautiously. I smiled. "Let it." He shrugged and said he'd have to present it to the board. Sure enough, the news spread quickly, and Karen came storming over to my house the very next morning, red-faced and shaking with fury. "What do you think you're doing?" she screeched, waving a copy of my petition in the air. I stayed calm and said, "Following the rules. The same rules you're so fond of." She got right up in my face and threatened, "You're going to regret this. I'll make sure of it." But the more she threatened, the calmer I felt, because I knew I had her cornered. Over the next week, the tension skyrocketed. Karen started spreading rumors about me to the neighbors, telling people I was aggressive, unstable, even dangerous. She claimed I had yelled at children in the neighborhood, which was a blatant lie. Thankfully, a few neighbors saw through her act and quietly offered me support. But most people stayed silent out of fear. Then came the board meeting where my petition would be discussed. I showed up early, dressed neatly, and armed with a binder full of evidence. Karen marched in like a general leading troops. Dragging along a few of her friends from the board, she immediately launched into a speech about how I was attacking her personally. But when it was my turn to speak, I calmly laid out my case with photos, dates, and citations from the HOA handbook. I showed videos of delivery trucks struggling to squeeze past her car. I highlighted the exact section that gave me the right to petition. The room grew quiet as I spoke, and I could see a few board members nodding along. Karen tried to interrupt me multiple times, but the chairperson told her to stay quiet. When I finished, there was a tense silence before the board said they would review and make a decision within 30 days. Karen looked smugged, like she thought she had already won. But I could tell the board was seriously considering my request. Over the next few weeks, Karen doubled down on her harassment. I found another violation notice on my door, claiming my porch light was too bright. I caught her snooping around my property taking photos. One night she even stood across the street yelling insults about how transient people like me didn't belong. I kept my head down, documenting everything. One night I overheard her telling another neighbor, "If he takes my spot, I'll make his life so miserable he'll move out. That was when I realized this wasn't just about parking for her, it was about control. She wanted everyone to bow down to her authority. Person to challenge her. Finally, the day of the next HOA meeting arrived. The one where the decision would be announced. Karen strutted in like she was already victorious. But when the chairperson read the verdict, her face turned pale. The board had voted in my favor. My petition was approved. Effective immediately, Karen was banned from using the easement spot. The room erupted in murmurs, and I sat there calmly as Karen's jaw dropped. She jumped up shouting, "This is illegal. This is harassment. You can't do this to me." But the chairperson reminded her that the board's decision was final. I walked out of that meeting feeling like I had just won a championship. Neighbors gave me subtle nods of approval, and one even whispered, "Thank you." But Karen was far from done. I knew she would find another way to strike back, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. Because if the war had been simmering before, it was about to boil over. The final reckless move came sooner than I thought, and it nearly turned everything upside down. Just a week after the rock through the window incident, I returned home late from work to find flashing red and blue lights all over the street. 2 police cars were parked in front of my house, and Karen was standing there with crocodile tears streaming down her face. Pointing at my home as if she had caught a criminal, my heart sank because I knew instantly she had called them again. I approached cautiously. The officers immediately stopped me and told me they had received a call that I was storing illegal substances inside my house. I was floored. It was the boldest and most dangerous lie she had ever told. I calmly but firmly told them to check the cameras. I had every angle of my property covered, and nothing remotely suspicious was happening. One officer, clearly tired of being dragged into Karen's vendettas, asked me if I'd consent to a quick walkthrough so they could close. The report, I agreed without hesitation, because I had nothing to hide. Within 10 minutes, they confirmed my house was perfectly clean and safe, and they came back outside to confront Karen. She started screaming that they weren't doing their jobs, that I had hidden evidence, but the officers shut her down and warned her that filing false police reports was a crime. They left with another formal complaint logged against her. But I stood in my driveway shaking, realizing just how far she was willing to go. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was dangerous. After that night, I doubled down on documenting everything. My lawyer expedited the restraining order process, and within days I had a temporary order in place that barred Karen from setting foot on my property or approaching me. The look on her face when she was served the papers was priceless, red with rage. Her mouth twisted into a snarl as she spat. "You won't win. I'll burn this whole place down before I let you take it from me," the officer serving her warned. Her to watch her words, but I could see the fire in her eyes. She meant every word. The neighborhood was buzzing after that. Whispers spread quickly that Karen had finally been legally muzzled. More neighbors came forward to me quietly, sharing their own stories of how she had bullied them over the years. One man told me she once fined him for leaving his Christmas lights up 2 days past the deadline. Another said she threatened to report his teenage son to the police for skateboarding. Near her driveway, the stories painted a picture of a woman who had ruled with fear for far too long. And now that she was cornered, she was unraveling in front of everyone. At the next HOA meeting, which she was barred from attending, the board formally voted to remove her from all committees and ban her from holding any position of authority ever again. They also announced new policies for accountability to prevent abuse of power. The neighbors actually applauded, something that hadn't happened at a meeting in years. I sat quietly in the back, a strange mix of relief and tension washing over me, because even though I had one on paper, I still felt the threat of Karen looming. And I was right. Because 2 nights later, at around midnight, the motion sensors on my cameras triggered an alert. I opened the feed on my phone and saw Karen standing in my driveway again, despite the restraining order, clutching something metallic in her hand. I called the police instantly, and within minutes they were there. Catching her red-handed trying to slash my tires, the restraining order turned the incident into an arrest. And for the first time, she was actually taken away in handcuffs. The neighborhood gathered silently as the squad car pulled away, and I could feel the weight of years of her terror lifting. But even as I watched her being driven off, I knew this wasn't quite the end. There would still be hearings. Still. be fallout. And Karen was the kind of person who would never accept defeat easily. The war had reached its climax, but one final chapter remained. I couldn't help but wonder just how far she would still try to go before this nightmare was finally over.